The moment Harper Evans spoke, the courtroom seemed to inhale all at once, as if the very idea of a teenager objecting to the prosecution was a shock. Judge Wallace Monroe narrowed his eyes, tapping his fingers against the desk. His smirk faded slightly, replaced with something colder, annoyance. "Excuse me," he repeated, his voice thick with disbelief. Harper didn't flinch. She didn't fumble. Instead, she stood her ground, hands steady at her sides, and repeated, "Objection, Your Honor." A ripple of whispers passed through the gallery. The prosecutor, Robert Greene, let out a sharp breath and turned toward her with a look of amusement and irritation. "On what grounds, Miss Evans?" Judge Monroe asked, leaning forward slightly. Harper kept her voice steady. "The prosecution is making assumptions about my intent without providing context. That's speculation, and speculation is inadmissible in a court of law." Silence. A beat passed. Then another. And then, a chuckle. It came from Judge Monroe himself, low and dismissive. He shook his head, sitting back in his chair. "You must be joking," he muttered. "A teenager trying to lecture me on courtroom procedures?" A few laughs erupted from the audience, filling the room with a condescending energy. Harper felt the weight of every stare, every judgment. She should have felt small. She should have felt intimidated. But she didn't. Instead, she let the moment stretch, let them enjoy their laughter, because soon, the tables would turn. Judge Monroe sighed, shaking his head. "Let's move on." Overruled. Greene, still smirking, continued as if Harper hadn't spoken. "As I was saying, I move to suppress the evidence," Harper cut in. The room fell silent again. This time, the chuckles stopped. Judge Monroe blinked, as if unsure he'd heard correctly. "You what?" "I move to suppress the evidence," Harper repeated, her voice unwavering. "The items that allegedly tie me to the crime scene were obtained without a proper warrant. That makes them inadmissible." Greene's smirk faltered. His jaw tensed. Judge Monroe stared at her for a long moment. "Miss Evans," he said slowly, "where exactly did you get your legal knowledge?" Harper let the corner of her lips lift, just slightly. "I read," she said simply. A few murmurs spread through the crowd, the mood beginning to shift. Harper knew exactly what they were thinking. Who was this girl? Why was she speaking like a lawyer? And most importantly, what else did she know? Judge Monroe's fingers drummed against the desk as he looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since she had walked into his courtroom. "Well," he muttered, his voice no longer carrying amusement but something closer to irritation. "If you want to play lawyer, Miss Evans, let's see if you can handle what comes next." Harper didn't respond. She just straightened her shoulders. Because what he didn't realize was, she had been ready for this from the start. And this courtroom was about to witness something they had never seen before. A game of assumptions. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. The judge's smirk had vanished. The gallery was no longer just watching for entertainment, they were invested now. Harper stood still, her heart steady. She could feel the weight of their stares, their curiosity, their doubt. Judge Monroe finally broke the silence. He sighed, rubbing his temples before speaking. "Miss Evans," he said, his voice thick with condescension, "this is not a debate club. This is a court of law. You do not get to decide what is admissible and what isn't." Harper's expression didn't waver. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I do. The Fourth Amendment protects against unlawful search and seizure. If the prosecution cannot prove that a valid warrant was obtained before they searched my belongings, then any evidence collected is inadmissible." A few people in the gallery murmured. Some nodded. Others frowned. The prosecutor, Robert Greene, scoffed. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous," he said, stepping forward. This young lady is simply repeating phrases she's heard on TV. The evidence is strong, and her presence at the scene is undeniable. Harper turned toward him, her voice calm. Mr. Green, are you saying I am incorrect about my constitutional rights? The room tensed. Judge Monroe looked at the prosecutor, his fingers tapping against the bench. He seemed slightly irritated. This case was supposed to be an easy win. Green forced a smile, but Harper could see the tension in his jaw. What I'm saying, he said slowly, is that we have clear proof that you were involved in the incident. Harper raised an eyebrow. Then present the warrant. The gallery stirred again. Harper kept her gaze locked on the prosecutor. His smirk was gone now, replaced by a tight expression. There is no warrant, he admitted through clenched teeth. Judge Monroe's fingers stopped tapping. Harper nodded slightly. Then the evidence is inadmissible. Judge Monroe sighed heavily. He adjusted his glasses and glared at the prosecutor. Is this true? Was the evidence obtained without a warrant? Green cleared his throat. Your Honor, given the circumstances. Yes or no, Mr. Green? Harper pressed. Green hesitated, then exhaled sharply. No warrant was issued, he admitted, his voice bitter. The tension in the room thickened. Harper could see it now, the first cracks in their case. Judge Monroe rubbed his forehead, clearly frustrated. Then I have no choice but to suppress the evidence. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The shift in the room was tangible. People had entered the courtroom expecting a quick conviction, a predictable outcome. Now, they weren't so sure. Harper kept her composure, but inside, she knew she had just landed her first major blow. Green turned to her, his eyes burning with quiet rage. That doesn't change the fact that you were there, Miss Evans, he snapped. You were found at the scene, and I have witness statements placing you there. Harper tilted her head. Would those witnesses be the same officers who detained me? Green's jaw clenched. Because if so, Harper continued, we need to address another issue, bias. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Judge Monroe raised an eyebrow. Bias? Harper took a step forward, her voice unwavering. Yes, Your Honor. I was detained by officers who had already decided I was guilty before an investigation even took place. That makes their statements unreliable. Green laughed sharply. Unreliable? Miss Evans, are you accusing law enforcement officers of misconduct? Harper didn't blink. I'm saying that assumptions were made before the facts were reviewed. And I can prove it. The room collectively inhaled. Judge Monroe sat up straighter. You have proof? Harper nodded. Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to present evidence that contradicts the prosecution's claim that I was at the scene of the crime for the reasons they assume. Green's face twisted in irritation. This is absurd. What evidence could she possibly have? Harper turned toward the judge. Permission to approach the bench? Judge Monroe hesitated. Then, intrigued, he gestured for her to proceed. Harper reached into her folder and pulled out a single piece of paper. She handed it to the bailiff, who carried it to the judge. Judge Monroe adjusted his glasses as he read. His expression shifted, first skeptical, then confused. Then something else. Shock. The prosecutor took a step forward. What is it? Judge Monroe didn't answer immediately. Instead, he lifted his gaze and stared at Harper, his previous amusement gone. He turned the paper over, shaking his head slightly. Then he looked at Green. Mr. Green, he said slowly, did you bother to run a background check on Miss Evans before filing this case? Green frowned. What? Judge Monroe exhaled sharply. Did you verify who she is? Green scoffed. She's a teenager. A minor. A defendant in this case. Judge Monroe tossed the paper onto his desk and leveled a long, hard stare at him. "No," he said. "She's an attorney." Silence. Complete. Deafening. Silence. The entire courtroom sat frozen. The prosecutor's face drained of color. The judge let the words settle in the air, watching as realization swept through the gallery. Harper Evans stood with her hands folded in front of her, unshaken, unbothered. Judge Monroe picked up the paper again, as if reading it a second time would make it any less shocking. "This is unbelievable," he muttered. Green, still in disbelief, shook his head. "That's impossible." Harper turned toward him, finally allowing a small smile to touch her lips. "Check the records," she said. The bailiff rushed to a computer, typing quickly. The sound of the keyboard was the only noise in the room. Seconds passed like hours. Then, finally, the bailiff turned to the judge, his face pale. He cleared his throat and spoke. "It's true, Your Honor." The gallery erupted. People whispered, gasped, leaned in to get a better look at the girl who had just turned the entire case upside down. Judge Monroe slammed his gavel, demanding order, but even he looked shaken. He turned back to Harper, narrowing his eyes. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that you are a licensed attorney at 17 years old?" Harper nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I graduated high school early, completed my law degree, and passed the bar exam last year." The prosecutor was at a loss for words. He looked at the judge, then at Harper, his confidence shattered. Judge Monroe ran a hand down his face, his expression unreadable. "So let me get this straight," he said. "The prosecution built this entire case on assumptions, and in doing so, failed to realize they were pressing charges against a fully licensed attorney?" Harper folded her arms. "That's correct, Your Honor." A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. Judge Monroe leaned back in his chair, staring at her as if seeing her for the first time. "Well, Miss Evans," he said, his voice quieter now. "I think we all misjudged you." Harper didn't respond right away. She let the weight of the moment sink in. Then, finally, she spoke. "I think a lot of people do, Your Honor," she said. And for the first time since this trial began, the judge had nothing to say. The turning point. The weight of Harper's revelation still hung heavy in the air, filling the courtroom with an almost surreal silence. No one had expected this, least of all Judge Monroe. For the first time, the balance of power had shifted. No longer was Harper Evans just a teenager standing trial. No longer was she the defendant everyone had assumed her to be. She was an attorney. And now, everyone in that courtroom was scrambling to figure out what that meant for the case they thought they had already won. Judge Monroe exhaled slowly, running a hand across his desk. He turned to Green, his once confident prosecutor who now stood motionless, his mouth slightly open in disbelief. "Mr. Green," the judge said, his voice measured, "it appears you have failed to conduct the most basic background check on the defendant." Green's jaw tightened. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this doesn't change the facts of the case." Harper tilted her head. "It doesn't?" she asked, her voice calm. "Because I think it changes everything." The judge's eyes flickered to her, watching her closely. Harper continued, stepping forward slightly. "Let's review what we know," she said. "The prosecution has built their argument on evidence that was illegally obtained. That's now inadmissible. They also relied on witness statements from officers who made assumptions about me without due diligence. Those statements are now unreliable." Green bristled. "We still have reasonable suspicion." Harper didn't blink. "Reasonable suspicion is not probable cause," she countered. "And it certainly isn't enough to convict." A ripple of murmurs passed through the courtroom. Harper could feel the tide turning. The very people who had laughed at her earlier were now whispering in awe. Judge Monroe leaned forward, pressing his fingers together. "Miss Evans," he said, his tone more careful now, "you have certainly proven that you're not an average defendant. But I must ask, why did you allow this trial to reach this point? If you are a licensed attorney, why not reveal that from the beginning?" Harper didn't hesitate. "Because I wanted to see how the system would treat me," she said. "I wanted to see whether I'd be given a fair chance or if assumptions would dictate the outcome." A hush fell over the room. The judge's expression darkened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition. "You were testing the system," he murmured. Harper nodded. "And it failed." Green let out a sharp laugh, though there was no amusement in it. "So what now, Miss Evans? Do you think this means you're free to walk out of here?" Harper turned to him. "Not just walk out," she said. "I'm moving for a full dismissal of all charges." Gasps erupted again. Even Judge Monroe's eyebrows lifted slightly. Green's eyes narrowed. "You can't be serious." Harper remained unwavering. "I am," she said. "And here's why." She picked up a file from her table and held it up. "Your Honor, this is a documented record of every wrongful conviction overturned due to prosecutorial misconduct in this state over the last 5 years." She handed it to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. Monroe skimmed the pages, his frown deepening. "Mr. Green," Harper continued, "you built a case on faulty evidence and false assumptions. The moment you failed to obtain a warrant, this case was lost. But instead of admitting that, you pushed forward, knowing full well that you lacked a foundation." The prosecutor's face burned with frustration, but he said nothing. Harper turned back to the judge. "My presence in this courtroom is not just a defense of my own innocence," she said. "It's an example of how easily a young black woman can be swept into the system without a second thought. If I weren't an attorney, this case would have played out differently. I would have been railroaded into a conviction based on nothing more than misplaced suspicion." A murmur of agreement moved through the gallery. Even some of the jurors looked unsettled. Judge Monroe tapped a finger against his desk, his expression unreadable. "Miss Evans," he said slowly, "are you accusing the prosecution of racial bias?" Harper met his gaze head-on. "I'm saying bias exists whether intentional or not," she replied. "And if this case doesn't prove that, I don't know what does." Another heavy silence followed. Green cleared his throat. "Your Honor, this is emotional manipulation. She's trying to paint this as some kind of grand statement when, in reality, she was found at the scene." Harper exhaled sharply. "You keep bringing that up," she said. "But have you once asked why I was there?" The prosecutor hesitated. Judge Monroe raised an eyebrow. "Why were you there, Miss Evans?" Harper finally allowed herself a small smile. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She turned toward the jury, making sure every single one of them was listening. "I was there," she said, "because I was investigating the case." Shock rippled through the courtroom. Green looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "What?" Harper reached into her file again and pulled out another document. "I was working pro bono," she explained. "I had been approached by a woman whose son was wrongfully accused of a crime. She suspected police corruption and asked me to look into it. That's why I was at the scene." She handed the document to the bailiff. The judge took it, his expression unreadable as he reviewed it. "This is a formal pro bono representation agreement," Monroe muttered. He looked up. "You were there as an attorney, gathering evidence?" Harper nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. And I have documentation proving that I was acting in a legal capacity, not as a criminal." Green's face was white with disbelief. "This," he sputtered. "This is absurd." Harper turned toward him. What's absurd is that I was never even given the opportunity to explain this before charges were filed, she said. Had anyone done their due diligence, this case never would have existed in the first place. Judge Monroe exhaled deeply, his fingers pressing against his temple. I need a recess, he muttered, standing up. Court is adjourned for 1 hour. He banged his gavel and left the bench. The moment he disappeared, the courtroom exploded with noise. Reporters rushed out to make calls. Spectators whispered furiously. Harper gathered her papers calmly, ignoring the stares, the disbelief. She had just dismantled their entire case in less than 10 minutes. And she wasn't done yet. The crumbling prosecution. The courtroom was in chaos. As soon as Judge Monroe called for recess, the gallery burst into animated whispers, journalists rushed outside to make calls, and even some jurors looked shaken by the unexpected turn of events. Harper remained still, her hands calmly stacking her papers into a neat pile. She had come prepared, but she knew this battle wasn't over yet. Robert Greene was livid. His face was still pale, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like he was grinding his teeth into dust. He stalked toward his table, muttering furiously to his assistant before storming out of the room. Harper watched him go, knowing exactly what he was thinking. He had walked into this courtroom expecting an easy win. A routine conviction. A teenager who would crumble under pressure. Instead, he was losing. And he had no idea how to stop it. Behind closed doors. An hour later, when court reconvened, the tension was even thicker than before. Judge Monroe took his seat, adjusting his robe before leveling a firm gaze at the prosecution. Mr. Greene, he said, his tone neutral but carrying an unmistakable weight, before we move forward, I'd like to ask you something. Greene straightened his tie, trying to compose himself. Yes, Your Honor. Monroe folded his hands in front of him. Given the new information presented by the defense, would you like to proceed with the case? The entire room held its breath. If Greene dropped the case now, it would be an admission of failure, a recognition that Harper had picked apart every piece of the prosecution's so-called evidence. But if he continued, he risked being humiliated further. Harper watched his internal battle play out in real time. She could see the sweat forming at his temples, the slight twitch of his fingers as he debated his next move. Finally, Greene inhaled sharply. Your Honor, I would like to proceed. A murmur spread through the crowd. Judge Monroe sighed, looking unimpressed but unsurprised. Very well, he said, turning toward Harper. Miss Evans, do you have further arguments to present? Harper stood, adjusting her blazer before stepping forward. Yes, Your Honor, she said. I'd like to address the flaws in the prosecution's timeline of events. She walked over to the display screen beside the jury box. Your Honor, the prosecution claims I was found at the scene of the crime at approximately 8:45 p.m., she said, clicking a button on her laptop. A surveillance image appeared on the screen. But this, she continued, is footage from a nearby ATM taken at 8:47 p.m., and it clearly shows me withdrawing money over 3 miles away from the alleged crime scene. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Greene's face paled even further. Judge Monroe frowned, leaning forward. Where did you obtain this footage? Harper met his gaze without hesitation. From the bank, Your Honor. I subpoenaed the records before this trial began. Monroe glanced at the bailiff. Can you confirm the legitimacy of this? The bailiff nodded. Yes, Your Honor. The footage is authentic. The judge turned back to Greene. Mr. Greene, do you have an explanation for this discrepancy? Greene opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He turned to his assistant, who frantically flipped through their notes, but no answer was coming. Harper didn't wait. I also have phone records, she continued, clicking again. A second image appeared, her call log. I was on a call with a client at 8:50 p.m., which means I couldn't have possibly committed the crime when they say I did. More gasps. Judge Monroe exhaled, clearly growing impatient. Mr. Green, he said sharply, how do you explain this? Green finally snapped. Your Honor, this is absurd, he shouted. She's manipulating the facts, twisting the story to make herself look innocent. Judge Monroe's expression darkened. Are you suggesting the evidence she presented is fabricated? Green hesitated. Monroe leaned forward. Because if you are, I will need proof of that allegation, right now. Green clenched his jaw but said nothing. Harper took a slow breath, knowing she had just cornered him completely. I think we all see what's happening here, she said. The prosecution built this case based on assumptions and flawed evidence. And when those assumptions were challenged, they had no way to defend them. She turned back to the judge. Your Honor, this case is beyond reasonable doubt. The prosecution has failed to establish motive, opportunity, or credible evidence. At this point, I have no choice but to request a motion to dismiss. Another shockwave rolled through the room. Judge Monroe sighed, rubbing his temples as if he had a headache. He looked at Green. Mr. Green, he said slowly, do you have any further arguments? Green hesitated, his shoulders slumping slightly. For the first time since the trial began, he looked defeated. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he muttered, no, Your Honor. Judge Monroe nodded, leaning back in his chair. He was silent for a long moment, then sighed heavily. In light of the evidence, or lack thereof, this court has no choice but to grant the defense's motion to dismiss. The words hung in the air like a bomb going off. Harper heard someone gasp. Another person murmured, unbelievable. She had done it. It was over. Judge Monroe banged his gavel. Case dismissed. Court is adjourned. And just like that, the trial that was supposed to end in her conviction had ended in her victory. The aftermath. The moment Harper stepped out of the courtroom, she was met with a wave of flashing cameras and reporters shouting questions. Miss Evans. How did you manage to win your case? Did you know you would win all along? What does this mean for the justice system? Harper stopped at the top of the courthouse steps, looking out at the sea of faces staring at her. She took a slow breath, then spoke into the microphone held out to her. This case wasn't about proving my intelligence, she said. It was about proving a point. The reporters leaned in. The justice system isn't broken, it's biased, she continued. Had I not been a lawyer, I would have been another statistic, another young black defendant steamrolled by a system designed to assume guilt before innocence. She let her words settle, scanning the faces of the people before her. But today, I prove that intelligence has no age, she said. That preparation is more powerful than privilege. And that justice should not be determined by assumptions. She paused, then added, and maybe, just maybe, today was the first step in making sure that changes. With that, she turned, her head held high, and walked away. The world had just witnessed something extraordinary. And Harper Evans wasn't done making history yet. The ripple effect. The case had been dismissed, but the storm it unleashed was just beginning. Harper barely had time to breathe before the media frenzy exploded. News outlets across the country picked up the story. Social media was ablaze with reactions, some in awe, others in disbelief. A 17-year-old black girl had just taken on the justice system and won. And now, the world wanted to know everything about her. The interview. 2 days after the trial, Harper found herself seated across from the legendary journalist, Vanessa Sinclair, on national television. The studio was cold, but Harper sat with the same composure she had in court. Vanessa smiled at her. Miss Evans, she began, your story has captivated the nation. Millions of people are calling you the teenage legal prodigy. How does that feel? Harper met her gaze. Honestly, she said. It feels surreal. I never expected this much attention. Vanessa nodded. You defended yourself with legal expertise that stunned even the judge. But what really shocked people was that you never revealed you were a lawyer until the prosecution had already made fatal mistakes. Why? Harper took a deep breath. Because I wanted to see the system for what it really is, she said. I wanted to know whether I'd be treated fairly, whether the evidence would be examined properly, or whether I'd be another statistic, guilty until proven innocent. Vanessa's expression turned serious. And what did you find? Harper's lips pressed into a thin line. I found that the system is built on assumptions, she said. Assumptions about race. About age. About who deserves to be heard and who doesn't. They didn't see me as a person, they saw a young black girl in handcuffs and assumed I was guilty. If I had revealed my credentials earlier, they would have taken me seriously from the start. But why should it take that? Why should I have to prove I deserve fairness? Vanessa let the weight of her words settle. That's a powerful statement, she said. Do you think your case will change anything? Harper exhaled slowly. I hope so, she said. But one case isn't enough. It's just the beginning. Vanessa leaned forward. So what's next for you, Harper? Harper smiled slightly. Change, she said. Big change. Backlash and resistance. Not everyone was thrilled about Harper's victory. Within days, conservative pundits accused her of playing the system and using a stunt to humiliate the courts. Some legal professionals called her case an anomaly, insinuating that it had no real significance in the grand scheme of things. Others went further, questioning her intelligence, her credentials, even the legitimacy of her bar certification. A 17-year-old attorney? Sounds like a fantasy. Who really passed that exam for her? Harper saw the comments, read the articles, heard the whispers. But she refused to be rattled. Because deep down, she knew the truth. The backlash wasn't about whether she deserved to win. It was about the fact that she did. That she had shattered expectations. That she had exposed the deep flaws in the system. That she had forced a conversation people weren't ready to have. And that scared them. Unexpected allies. Not everyone opposed her, though. Days after her interview, Harper received an invitation to meet with Judge Monroe in his chambers. She wasn't sure what to expect, but when she arrived, he stood from his desk and extended a hand. Miss Evans, he said. I owe you an apology. Harper blinked. Excuse me? Judge Monroe sighed, rubbing his temples. When you walked into my courtroom, I made an assumption about you, he admitted. I thought you were an overconfident kid who had no idea what she was doing. I was wrong. Harper studied him carefully. He chuckled dryly. I've been on the bench for over 20 years, he said. And in all that time, I have never seen a defendant, or a lawyer, argue with the level of precision and confidence that you did. Harper folded her arms. So why did you treat me like I was nothing? Monroe exhaled heavily. Because that's what the system does, he admitted. It's what I was trained to do, evaluate based on experience, patterns, statistics. But you forced me to see beyond that. You forced me to look at you, not as a defendant, not as a case number, but as a person. Harper was silent for a moment. And what are you going to do about that? She asked. Monroe let out a small chuckle. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? He paused, then met her gaze. I can't fix the justice system overnight. But I can start by doing better. By questioning my own biases. By mentoring young attorneys who challenge the status quo. He took a deep breath. And, if you're willing, I'd like to offer you a clerkship in my office. Harper's eyes widened. A judge was offering her, a 17-year-old, a job. She hesitated. "Are you sure?" Monroe smiled. "Harper," he said. "If there's one thing I've learned about you, it's that you don't need anyone to be sure for you. You make your own way. And if you say yes, I have no doubt you'll change this field forever." Harper studied him for a moment. Then, finally, she extended her hand. "I accept." The next chapter. With the court case behind her and Monroe's mentorship secured, Harper found herself at the center of a legal revolution. She became an overnight inspiration, especially for young black students who had never seen someone like them command a courtroom the way she had. Law schools invited her to speak. Activists reached out, wanting her voice in their movement. People who had been wrongly accused flooded her inbox, asking if she could represent them. And, despite all of it, she still had one more goal. The day after accepting Monroe's offer, Harper stood outside a youth detention center, the same one where so many teens like her had been processed without ever getting a fair shot. She took a deep breath, then stepped inside. A group of young boys and girls sat before her, their faces filled with skepticism. She cleared her throat. "My name is Harper Evans," she said. "A week ago, I was sitting where you are, facing a system that wanted to define me before I even had the chance to speak for myself." A few of them perked up. She continued. "I won my case," she said. "Not just because I knew the law, but because I knew my worth." She let that sink in. "The system wants you to believe you don't have power," she said. "That your fate is already decided. That you don't get to fight back." She met their eyes. "But I'm here to tell you, you do." A spark flickered in the room. And in that moment, Harper knew, her fight wasn't just about her anymore. It was about all of them. And she wasn't going to stop until every young person like her knew that they, too, had the power to rewrite the rules.